Hello and welcome to the channel Echoes Shadows. Do you consider yourself ready for any adventure in the wild? These real and terrifying trail stories will change your perception with supernatural encounters, unexpected dangers, and moments of pure fear. Watch until the end and discover what lurks in the shadows of the forest. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming stories. Thank you very much. Story 1. Whispers in the Forest.
My name is Michael, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina. It's a small city surrounded by mountains and forests, perfect for anyone who loves hiking. I've always been into nature, and my girlfriend Emily shares the same passion. She's a graphic designer, and I teach history at a local high school. On our days off, we often find ourselves exploring the trails around the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a Saturday afternoon in early fall. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, so we decided to try a trail we hadn't hiked before. A friend had mentioned it, saying it wasn't very well known, which only made it more intriguing. We packed some snacks, threw on our hiking boots, and headed out. At first, everything was fine. The trail was peaceful, surrounded by tall trees with the sunlight filtering through the branches. The air was crisp, and the sound of our footsteps mixed with the occasional rustle of leaves. But as we ventured deeper, things started to feel off. The path became more narrow, the trees more dense. It was like the forest was closing in on us. The air turned colder too, though the sun was still out. It was subtle at first, but noticeable. Emily mentioned it, and I felt it too, like the day was changing around us. Then came the smell. At first it was faint, but soon it became impossible to ignore. It was metallic, like iron, mixed with damp earth. We stopped and looked around, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but there was nothing. It just lingered, heavy and unsettling. We decided to keep walking, but after a few minutes, everything went eerily quiet. No wind, no birds, just silence. The kind that makes your skin crawl. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft and distant, like it was coming from all directions at once. "Did you hear that?" I asked Emily, but she was already pale, her eyes wide as if she had seen something. Before she could respond, a gust of wind hit us out of nowhere, so strong it nearly knocked us off our feet. The weird part? The trees didn't move. It was like the wind was only around us. Our hearts were pounding, but we kept going, more out of instinct than anything else. Suddenly, I felt a shove, like someone had pushed me from behind. I stumbled forward, landing hard on my knees. My palms scraped against the rocky ground, and I turned, expecting to see Emily had tripped into me, but she was standing still, staring at something behind me. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "Mike, look." I turned, and that's when I saw it. There, between the trees, was a figure. It wasn't solid. It looked like smoke in the shape of a person. There were no features, just the outline of something, watching us. It floated, moving slightly like it was shifting with the wind. My entire body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier around me. Then out of nowhere, images flashed through my mind. They weren't mine though. I saw a woman running through the woods, terror in her eyes. She was screaming, but no one was there to hear her. I felt her fear, her desperation, like it was my own. Each vision sent a wave of cold through me, my spine tingling with each flash. Emily grabbed my arm, pulling me back to reality. We started moving faster, almost running, but it didn't feel like we were alone. The wind started again, swirling from different directions, as if it was chasing us. And then, just like before, another shove, this time hitting Emily. She fell hard, crying out as she hit the ground. When I helped her up, I saw them. Bruises on her ankle, shaped like long, thin fingers. There was no explanation for how they got there. "Mike, we have to go," she begged, her voice shaking. I knew she was right, but as we turned to leave, the trail seemed unfamiliar, like the forest had changed around us. No matter where we looked, it all seemed the same. Endless trees, no way out. Then, everything stopped. The wind, the whispers. It was like the world held its breath. But it wasn't relief we felt, only dread. I sensed it, right behind us. Emily was crying softly now, her breath shaky. I wanted to move, but it was like my feet were stuck. Then we saw it again. The figure, only this time it was closer. Its form had more detail now, a face barely visible, distorted, like it was caught between this world and somewhere else. A chorus of whispers surrounded us, louder this time, like 1,000 voices speaking in a language we couldn't understand. In a burst of panic, I grabbed Emily's hand and we ran. We didn't look back, didn't slow down, just ran like our lives depended on it. And deep down, I knew they did. After what felt like hours, we finally burst out of the forest. The sky was clear, the wind calm, but everything felt wrong. We had left something behind, but I knew something had followed us out too. We've never gone back to that trail. And the worst part? Sometimes late at night when everything is quiet, I can still feel it. The same cold stillness, like I'm being watched, and the faint sound of a whisper in the wind.
Story 2. The Trail of No Return.
My name is Jake. I'm 25 years old, and I'm from Boulder, Colorado. I've always loved adventure, especially hiking. On weekends, my friends and I would hit the trails, but one hike turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It all happened in Rocky Mountain National Park. My buddies, Chris, Dylan, and Ashley and I planned a hike to a waterfall that none of us had been to before. We left late, as usual, and hit the trail around 11 a.m. The day was perfect. The trees were tall, the view of the mountains was breathtaking, and everything felt right. Until it didn't. About 2 hours into the hike, everything went silent. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, nothing. Just dead quiet. I got chills down my spine. Ashley was the first to mention it. "Guys, this is weird, right?" We all laughed nervously, but deep down, I knew she was right. The air felt heavy, and something wasn't right. We kept going, but about 20 minutes later, Chris stopped suddenly. "You see that?" he asked, pointing off the trail into the woods. Through the trees, we saw an old abandoned cabin. It didn't belong there. It wasn't on the map, and it looked like it had been forgotten for years. We cautiously approached it, and the place was falling apart, covered in moss and branches. Of course, Ashley, being the curious one, peeked through the window and jumped back, startled. "I saw someone in there," she said, her voice shaky. We all rushed to the window, but there was nothing, just darkness. The wind seemed to pick up suddenly, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I urged everyone to move on, get away from that place. As we hurried down the trail, we heard a loud snap. A huge branch had fallen out of nowhere, nearly hitting Dylan. We nervously joked about it, but no one was laughing for real. A few minutes later, another branch, this time smaller, flew through the air and struck Chris hard on the shoulder. It hadn't just fallen, it had been thrown. That's when we realized something wanted us gone. The wind grew stronger, swirling leaves around us and creating strange sounds all over. It felt like the forest was alive, watching us, closing in on us. Nobody said a word, but we all felt the same creeping dread. Suddenly, Chris froze again and pointed. In the distance, through the trees, stood a woman, or something that looked like a woman, but she wasn't right. Her outline was blurry, like she was made of smoke or shadow, and she just stood there, watching us. My heart raced. There was no sound, but the air around her seemed colder. Then, she started to move toward us, but not like a normal person. She floated, her feet never touching the ground. I can't explain it, but at that moment, we all bolted. The sounds of branches breaking and leaves crunching underfoot were deafening as we ran. No one dared look back. We just ran as fast as we could. As we scrambled through the forest, I got separated from Chris and Ashley. It was just me and Dylan now, breathless and panicked. The silence returned, but it was suffocating. I called out for Chris, but there was no answer. The forest itself seemed to shift, and the path in front of us twisted, like it was trying to keep us lost. After what felt like an eternity, we found Chris and Ashley. They were leaning against a tree, gasping for air. Ashley looked shaken, pale. She said she felt a cold hand grab her arm while she was running, but when she looked, no one was there. Her face said it all. Something was hunting us, something we couldn't see. We didn't waste another second. We ran as fast as we could, but the trail felt like it was leading us in circles. Every step felt wrong, like the ground was shifting beneath us. The wind howled, and the trees creaked as if they were alive, moving closer. Finally, after what felt like hours, we saw the end of the trail. It was getting dark, and I'd never been so relieved in my life. No one spoke until we were back in the car, driving toward Boulder. The ride back was quiet. None of us could explain what had happened, and honestly, I don't think any of us wanted to. That was the last hike we ever did together. Something in that forest changed us, made us see the world differently. I haven't been back to Rocky Mountain National Park since. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that shadowy figure in the woods, watching us, following us. It's a feeling I can't shake, like the forest isn't done with us yet.
Story 3. The Shadow by the Waterfall.
I've always been a laid-back guy, living in Portland, Oregon. I've always loved nature, and when the idea of hiking to Shadow Falls came up, I was excited. I work as a graphic designer, spending long hours in front of a screen, so these outdoor trips are my way of unwinding. The friends I was supposed to go with backed out last minute, but I decided to go solo anyway. It was a Saturday morning. The sky was overcast, but there was no sign of rain. I packed my backpack, grabbed my camera, and set off. The trail began on a dirt road, pretty straightforward, and for the first half hour, everything was peaceful. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, just the usual forest sounds. But after a while, something started to feel off. I had that weird feeling, like someone was watching me. I looked around, but there was nothing there. Ignoring the unease, I kept walking. A few minutes later, I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was something else. Whispers, multiple voices, all talking at once. I stopped to listen, but I couldn't make out any of the words. It was just a low, unsettling murmur. I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced behind me, wondering if I should turn back, but something urged me to keep going. Then, as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. The silence was so abrupt it was almost eerie. That's when I saw her. Off to the right, just beyond the trees, stood a woman. She had her back to me, wearing a white dress that was dirty, caked with mud. I froze, staring at her, unsure if I was really seeing this. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. No response. My heart began to race. I took a few steps back, and that's when she slowly turned her head. When I finally saw her face, I wished I hadn't. Where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, hollow sockets. My entire body went cold. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring. And then, in an instant, she vanished. She didn't walk away, didn't fade. She was just gone. I stumbled backward, tripping over a branch, barely catching myself. My hands were shaking. I've never believed in ghosts or any of that, but what I saw felt real. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that maybe I was just tired, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I kept going, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavy, and the deeper I went into the forest, the darker it got. The trees closed in around me, and the usual forest sounds had completely vanished. The silence was suffocating. Every step I took felt like it was leading me towards something I didn't want to face. Then out of nowhere, a shadow darted across the trail in front of me. It was fast and large, too big to be an animal. I froze, unsure if I should keep going. What's happening here? I thought, but I had no answers, just more questions. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move forward, though every instinct screamed at me to turn around. Not long after, I started hearing footsteps behind me. Clear, distinct footsteps, as if someone was following me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, but every time I looked, the path was empty. I began to walk faster, my heart pounding. The faster I went, the louder the footsteps behind me became, until it sounded like someone was just a few feet away. I broke into a run, fear gripping me. The footsteps stayed right on my heels. I was terrified, convinced that whatever was following me was about to catch me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached a clearing. There it was, Shadow Falls. But something was wrong. The water, which should have been crystal clear, had a murky, reddish tint. The sound of the waterfall, which should have been soothing, was deafening, and there was a thick mist hovering around it. Every fiber of my being told me not to get any closer, but it was too late. That's when I saw them. All around the falls were figures. They looked like people, but at the same time, they didn't. I couldn't see their faces, just their dark silhouettes. They were all standing still, watching me. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I felt like something was crushing me, pushing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then, the figures started to move, slowly, in my direction. I was frozen, unable to do anything but watch as they got closer. One figure moved faster than the others, and when it was near enough, I saw it was the same woman I'd seen earlier, the one without eyes. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. It was just an empty void, and it made my skin crawl. At that moment, something inside me snapped, and I finally regained control of my body. I turned and ran, not caring about anything else but getting as far away from there as possible. I ran through the trees, branches slashing at me, but I didn't stop. The shadows seemed to close in around me, but I kept going. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the dirt road where my car was parked, I was out of breath, my hands trembling so much I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I sped out of there, my heart still racing, my mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't tell anyone the full story. How could I? No one would believe me. For days I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face, those empty sockets staring back at me. I still don't know what I saw, but I know it was real. Something in those woods wasn't right, and whatever it was, it hadn't wanted me there.
Story 4. Songs of the Night.
I live in Asheville, North Carolina, a city surrounded by nature and known for its beautiful trails. I work as a civil engineer, and my job keeps me busy most of the time. Hiking with friends is my way to unwind. My hiking group consists of my girlfriend Sarah, my best friend Jake, and his girlfriend Emily, who recently started joining us. On the day when everything happened, we decided to explore a trail in Pisgah National Forest, about an hour's drive from the city. It was a cloudy Sunday, but we were used to hiking in all kinds of weather. The trail we chose led to a hidden waterfall, one that wasn't well known to tourists, but Sarah had been to a few years back. We left Asheville around 8 a.m. and got to Pisgah just before 9. Sarah was confident she knew the way, even though the trail was more remote than the ones we were used to. We started the hike in high spirits, chatting and laughing. I remember the first 2 hours felt like any other hike, peaceful, with the sound of leaves crunching under our boots and birds chirping. But then, things started to change. The air around us became strangely heavy, and the sounds of the forest began to fade. It was as if nature itself had gone silent. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but I could tell the others felt it too. Everyone's pace slowed, and the conversations died down. Then, out of nowhere, Jake screamed. He was walking behind us with Emily, and when I turned around, I saw him staring into the trees, pale as a ghost. "Did you see her?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. We looked where he was pointing, but there was nothing there. He insisted he'd seen a woman dressed in white, floating between the trees. "She had no feet," he muttered, clearly shaken. None of us knew what to say. I wanted to calm him down, but I felt a chill creep up my spine too. Something about the forest didn't feel right anymore. We decided to keep moving, but the atmosphere had completely changed. Sarah gripped my hand tightly as we walked in silence. After a while, we started hearing a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a distant voice singing, but it grew louder the further we went. "Do you guys hear that?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide. It was unmistakable. The voice was female, singing a melody that none of us recognized. It was beautiful, yet eerie, and it seemed to come from all around us. Jake kept glancing back nervously, and the tension in the group was palpable. The further we walked, the louder the voice became, and I started to feel that we were being led somewhere we didn't want to go. That's when Emily screamed. She pointed toward the dense woods, and my blood ran cold. Standing there was a small figure, a child, or at least it looked like one. But something was terribly wrong. Its eyes glowed, reflecting light that didn't exist in the forest. The child didn't move, just stared at us from between the trees. My heart raced. I wanted to say something, but fear had closed my throat. Sarah began to cry softly, and none of us knew what to do. The child's figure stayed still, watching us as we stood frozen in place. We had no choice but to keep moving, though every step felt heavier than the last. The singing grew louder, almost unbearable, and the tension was suffocating. Jake, usually the brave one, walked faster, urging us to get to the waterfall. He kept saying it was close, but I could tell he was as scared as the rest of us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached a clearing where we could hear the waterfall. Relief should have washed over us, but what we saw was horrifying. The water wasn't the clear blue we had expected. It had a reddish tint, like it was stained. And instead of the peaceful rush of water, the sound was more like a roar, loud, angry, almost like it was alive. Then we saw them. Dark figures, shadow-like, were moving around the waterfall. They had no clear form, just black shapes that floated near the water, shifting and flickering like smoke. We were all rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. Jake dropped to his knees, unable to speak, while Sarah sobbed quietly next to me. I felt completely helpless, as if an invisible force was holding us there. The shadows began to move toward us, slow but deliberate. The singing had turned into a distorted wail, and amidst the shadows, the woman Jake had seen earlier appeared. She was dressed in white, her face pale with empty, glowing eyes. She floated just like Jake had described, her feet never touching the ground. I knew we had to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Lucas broke the silence, yelling that we had to run. He sprinted down the trail, and we followed, running for our lives. The forest around us seemed to blur as we fled, and the wailing seemed to chase us, echoing through the trees. We didn't stop until we saw the parking lot and the safety of our car. We scrambled inside and sped away without saying a word. The drive back to Asheville was eerily quiet. No one knew how to explain what we had just experienced, and I don't think any of us wanted to try. Since that day, we've never spoken about what happened. Emily stopped hiking with us, and Jake, who was always the first to suggest new adventures, hasn't mentioned another trail since. As for me, I still wake up some nights with the sound of that singing echoing in my head. The forest, once a place of peace for me, now feels like a place I never want to return to.